Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at to what extent Nazi radicalisation of racial policy was advanced through legal reforms. So I've already highlighted for you some key terms you might want to pick out in this question, and I would always advise doing this when you're sitting the exam. So to what extent was the Nazi radicalisation of racial policy, so that's what we're focusing on, radicalisation of racial policy, advanced through legal reforms? So we're going to have to start by talking about legal reforms, and the question is that the main way that racial policy was radicalised 1933 to 39? So already we should be thinking this is after Hitler's become Chancellor, all the way up to World War II. Now my argument is going to be that legal reforms were not the most important way that radicalisation of racial policy was advanced, and that actually support of the police was the most important way that racial policy was advanced, followed by eugenics and scientists, and then legal reforms, fourth propaganda, and finally educational reforms as the least important way that racial policy was radicalised in this period. So let's start by having a look at legal reforms. Okay, so legal reforms, there were lots of them, and I'm sure some that will pop to mind quite quickly will be things like the Nuremberg laws, the civil service laws, and various other ones. However, I would argue that up until 1938, most of the legal reforms actually weren't particularly successful in radicalising racial policy. For example, some of the earliest racial laws, 1933 civil service laws, for example, which said that Jews should be dismissed from jobs like in teaching, in law, and in government, were actually very difficult to enforce. So although the Nazis had the intention of excluding Jews from society, which would be radicalising racial policy, they didn't really have a scientific way of defining what a Jew was. And Hindenburg himself also exempted any Jews who'd fought in World War I as soldiers from being dismissed from civil service jobs. So the 1933 civil service laws had very limited impact for racial policy. Similarly, Nuremberg laws of 1935, which did things like say that only Aryans were now citizens, and that Jews and non-Aryans were now subjects rather than citizens and lost many of their legal rights, and that the protection of German blood and honour meant that they could no longer marry Aryans and non-Aryans, and there's no sex happening between Jews and non-Jews and things like that. Although those laws are being passed in 1935, and again that is radicalisation of racial policy, you could still say that it was still limited in the way that it was put in place. For example, still it was very difficult to say how to define what a non-Aryan was or what a Jew was. The Nuremberg laws stated that you had to have 3 of your grandparents who were Jewish, and that would mean you would count as a Jew or a non-Aryan, and in some cases perhaps 2 grandparents. It was really difficult still to enforce and to look into, was quite long and time consuming. So although these laws did help to radicalise racial policy, they weren't the main reason. And we can see this with other groups as well. So for example, lesbians were not actually in any way covered by Nazi laws, and there were no formal laws against asocials or the work shy or beggars, as sometimes the Nazis would call them. And in this way, there's real limitations to the argument that legal reforms were pushing forward racial policy, because we know that those different groups were being persecuted. However, you could argue that there are cases where legal reforms did radicalise racial policy. For example, in July 1933, there's a law passed called the Law for the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases. And that law led to around 400,000 people with mental, physical and psychological disabilities being sterilised. That actually led to immediate action against those groups of people, and in that way you could say that actually that law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases in July 1933 really did advance racial policy through legal reform. And similarly, actually policy against homosexuals It was already illegal in Weimar Republic to be caught doing acts of homosexuality, but that was quite hard to prove. And so the Nazis did pass a further law in 1935 stating that it was illegal to even be homosexual in any way, to express an interest in it or have thoughts about it. And that led to 22,000 homosexuals being arrested between 1936 and 1938. Many were sent to concentration camps and made to wear pink triangles on their uniforms. And indeed, towards 1937 to 39, some judges even ordered castration to happen. And in that way, you could definitely argue that legal reforms did have a significant impact quite early on in radicalising racial policy towards homosexuals. In terms of laws towards the Jews specifically and radicalisation of racial policy towards them, it's probably around about the 1938 mark that you see laws being passed that have significant radicalisation of racial policy impact on the Jews. So, for example, 1938, October 1938, we see passports of Jewish people being stamped with a J, which made them much more easily identifiable by the Nazis, which meant it was easier for them to be persecuted. So there's a real change from October 1938, and that may well be prompted by events that have happened recently in Austria with Anschluss, for example. In 1938, Jews were also no longer entitled to public welfare, and registration of Jewish property happens, and they start confiscating property worth over 5,000 marks that the Jews have as well. However, it's worth noting yet again that there are limitations to radicalisation of racial policy being advanced through legal reforms, because actually many of the laws were contradictory. For example, lots of laws tried to aim at encouraging Jews and other undesirables, as the Nazis called them, to emigrate, to leave the country, but other laws also made it harder to do so. So, for example, they're stamping Jewish passports with a J, they're no longer able to have public welfare, but they're also confiscating Jewish property in 1938, which makes it harder for them to be able to afford to leave the country. So in that way, legal reforms aren't actually necessarily helping the Nazis radicalise their racial policy. In some ways, it's confusing it, it's contradictory. In contrast, the support of the police force was one of the key ways that the Nazis were able to radicalise their racial policy in this period. So, for example, we could argue that it's the SA, the brown shirts, who carried out the early boycotts of Jewish shops that Goebbels had organised through propaganda. And it's the stormtroopers who broke into the Institute of Sexual Sciences in Berlin and confiscated 35,000 photos and 12,000 books and burned them as part of the book burning in May 1933 because of their homosexual content. And similarly, we could say, around 1936, Himmler is the one who forms the Reich Central Office for Combating Abortion and Homosexuality, which led to the arrest of 22,000 homosexuals in the following years. And it's the police force again in September 1933 that coordinate police attacks and raids that took place all over Germany against those who were work shy. They called it Beggars' Week. 100,000 people were taken into custody by police. June 1938, national campaign against the work shy, 11,000 further arrests. Many of them were sent to concentration camps like Buchenwald. And 1937 to 1939, the police seized address books and created a network of informers. 100,000 homosexuals were arrested, 50,000 were sent to prisons, regular prisons, and 15,000 were sent to concentration camps. Between 1935 and 38, the Ziegenlager internment camps for gypsies were set up all over Germany. And all of these things really show that it's the police force themselves, or the secret police, the Gestapo, the SS in particular, the SS, who are leading all of these radical racial policies. They're the ones who are actually carrying them out. Without the support of the police forces, it's very unlikely that any of this would have actually happened. For example, quite a famous example of radical racial policy happening would be Reichskristallnacht, sometimes just called Kristallnacht in some of the books you might have read, 9th to the 10th of November 1938. We had 91 Jews who were killed, many Jewish shops smashed and synagogues burnt. All of that violence of Reichskristallnacht, although it was made to look like it was sporadic and spontaneous, was actually organised by Goering, who was the head of the Gestapo. The Gestapo were originally based in Prussia, which was sort of the west and northeast part of Germany. And if you look at maps of the Reichskristallnacht attacks, there's a really good one in the Democracy and Nazism book by Robert Whitfield and Sally Waller. It's really clear that most of the attacks in Reichskristallnacht happened in the west and the northeast of Germany, and that the Gestapo were strongest there. So actually most of the attacks were being led by the SA and the SS men. It gave the impression, because it happens in lots of places all at once over Germany, that many people are supporting radical racial policy, but in actual fact it's all the support of the police, and it's their coordination under Goering that leads to Reichskristallnacht being such a major event. Similarly, you could argue that Heydrich, after 1938, a key person in the SS, after the 1938 Anschluss, where they joined up with Austria, he is the one who leads a trial of how they're going to deal with all the Jews that they have inherited, if you like, in Austria. And he is the one who forces 45,000 Austrian Jews to emigrate from Austria by confiscating property from many Jews there, and using that money that he's got from confiscated property and goods to effectively raise funds to make sure that he can move those Jews out of Austria. And those ideas are then used elsewhere in Germany later on. So all of these things are really showing quite clearly that support of the police and their coordination was key to enable radicalisation of racial policy, and much more important than the laws themselves. After all, many of these police forces were pretty much immune to the courts of law, so it didn't matter whether there was a law in place if they wished to persecute a group of people. Eugenics and scientists themselves in Germany, as well as they may have called themselves, were a key reason for radicalisation of racial policy as well. It was easier for the Nazis to radicalise racial policy on the basis of a lot of science that was going on at the time called Eugenics, which was about the study of races. And in fact, in other countries, Eugenics and ideas of social Darwinism, the adaptation of Darwin's ideas about survival of the fittest, had led to countries like Canada, Sweden and 35 US states already experimenting with sterilisation before the Nazis were in power. And these things made it easier for the Nazis to pass laws. And in that way you could definitely argue that actually eugenics and scientists and their work already made it easier for legal reforms to happen that helped radicalise racial policy. So eugenics and scientists are also more important as a cause of radicalisation than legal reforms. And scientists played a major role in justifying many of the policies. So some examples of this. Dr. Robert Ritter was a scientist who claimed to look into something called criminal biology. He said that criminal behaviour was genetically determined. It depended on your birth and your DNA. And he became the director of the Centre for Research on Racial Hygiene. And he did a study in 1936 looking at 30,000 Roma and Sinti, or as the Nazis often called them, gypsies. And he came to the conclusion of his study that 10% of the Roma and Sinti were pure Aryans, and 90% of them were mixed race, and therefore a danger to the Volk or a danger to the German people. And his study which he claimed was scientific, led to the justification that Himmler needed in 1936 to pass anti-Roma and Sinti laws, which led to the Roma and Sinti being moved into camps outside of Berlin in 1936. There's about 600 of them ringed by police officers and not being allowed to leave, and later to many of them being sent to concentration camps, wearing black triangles if they were asocial, or green triangles being called habitual criminals. And similarly, you see the role of scientists in many of the courts as well. So eugenics courts were set up where scientists were called on, and hereditary health courts also. Obviously, the Nazis were choosing people there to be judges who were very pro-sterilisation and pro quite radical racial policy. But their presence there sort of gave it the look of legitimacy. Often these courts only made decisions in about 10 minutes, and 60% of the people that they forcibly sterilised were classed as feeble-minded or morally insane, and they were the ones who were leading the 400,000 sterilisations that we talked about under legal reforms. So without these scientists supporting these hereditary health courts and kind of giving the justifications for eugenics courts, it's unlikely that they would have been able to so easily and so quickly, under Hitler, justify these policies. Dr. Philip Bühler also, although very much towards the end of the period that we're looking at here, was in charge of advocating euthanasia of the children and the disabled and the ill in particular, a programme which later becomes known as the T4 campaign. And he starts that up around 1939, and he makes it easier for people to become involved by making it really bureaucratic and paperwork based. So people filled in forms and sent them to a T4 office in far away from them, and then those people in the office of T4 are processing the forms and things, which meant people were happier that they weren't making the decision themselves, and it seemed to be somehow scientific in that it would therefore be okay. So in that way, eugenics and scientists play a key role in the justification of the Nazis' policies. Propaganda was not as important as a cause of radicalisation of racial policy. It did play a role. Goebbels, for example, organised the first official boycott of Jewish shops, which happens early on in 1933, but that only actually lasted one day, and many people didn't really support it, and it was very difficult, as we've discussed previously, to determine what a Jewish shop was. Is it half Jewish? Is it part German? Whatever, it's owned by a foreign business or company. It's difficult to actually determine that, so it was quite unsuccessful. Anti-Semitic signs were encouraged, but often people just displayed them to keep the Nazis happy and allow them rather than because they believed in the cause. We know that after events like Reichskristallnacht, we've got key individuals like in the US Embassy, that they report that lots of people were disappointed and quite shocked at the events in 1938 of Reichskristallnacht, especially the burning of synagogues. So propaganda wasn't entirely successful. But we do know that they get more and more control over things. So, for example, from October 1933, the Reichspress law, although that is a legal reforms are more significant than propaganda, closed down the free press, and that meant less opposition was able to speak out. We know that there were lots of messages like well-educated Jews are a danger, and weekly Nazi posters. In 1938 there's one which focuses on the cost of treating the mentally ill and the physically and hereditary ill, and highlighting that to people to try and get them to accept that there's a need to get rid of this problem, in inverted commas, that the Nazis saw. And lots of focused on Lebensraum as well, living space, and that it was necessary and it was being taken away from you by these other minority groups. But propaganda certainly wasn't as significant in enabling radicalisation of racial policy. People were less likely to speak out, not because of propaganda, but because of fear of the police and what might happen to them. And finally, educational reforms played a minor role, although certainly not as significant as propaganda as a whole, and legal reforms certainly. For example, law against overcrowding of German schools and universities in April 1933, a legal reform, actually leads some of the educational reforms. It restricted the number of Jews attending schools and universities, and gave more resources to Aryans, and that kind of segregation in schools that is encouraged, although it's not fully until 1938 anyway, made it easier to get Aryan children to accept propaganda because they're not coming into as much contact with Jews and other minorities. Textbooks were vetted to make sure that they have the right message in them. School books and exam questions included Jews being shown as bullies and other minorities, and the sick being shown as a drain on resources for Aryans and on Lebensraum, etc. And the curriculum increasingly was controlled. From 1935, the Ministry of Education controlled what could be taught. Geography, for example, was used to teach about Lebensraum and how other races were a drain, in particular people from Russia and Poland, that they were on the land that should belong to Germany, etc. And racial health was taught as well, so that was in the form of PE, and also biology with a focus on evolution and social Darwinism, and on race and hereditary sort of things being inherited in your genes. But obviously these things may have slightly reduced opposition from the youth, but it wasn't the main way that they managed to advance radicalisation of racial policy. So to conclude, legal reforms did play a role, and they were significant in helping to legalise radicalisation of racial policy, but ultimately the most important thing in radicalising racial policy was the support of the police forces, the stormtroopers, the SS, the Gestapo, because they're the ones that actually led many of the more successful policies, successful radical policies like Reichskristallnacht, and the boycott of Jewish shops was led by them, and they're the ones who actually sort of round people up and put them into concentration camps and arrest them, and put that level of fear in place that means that the people who aren't speaking out, even when they don't agree with propaganda, they're the reason why that's happening. Eugenics and scientists were also more important than legal reforms because they provided the justification for the reforms. So, and in that way, legal reforms, although they're more important than propaganda and educational reforms, were not the main reason that radicalisation of racial policy happens in this period, 1933 to 1939. Good luck with your revision. I would highly recommend now pausing this video, writing down the question, and then having a go at replanning the answer without looking at the information on the screen. Best of luck.